What kind of empire builds its power on fear, crushes rebellion with iron, and teaches the ancient world the art of terror itself? And how could a civilization so powerful, so unstoppable, vanish into the dust, leaving only broken statues and blood-stained chronicles behind? This is the story of the Assyrian Empire, a force so fierce that even its enemies carved its name into their prayers, begging their gods for protection. It was the empire of siege towers, of iron blades glinting in the Mesopotamian sun, of kings who ruled like gods and struck fear across the ancient Near East. Yet, behind the walls of Nineveh and Ashur, behind the thunder of their chariots, lay a story of obsession, cruelty, brilliance, and a slow, inevitable collapse. Picture the great city of Nineveh at dawn, colossal gates of bronze, streets lined with statues of lions and winged bulls, the air thick with the smoke of conquest. But far to the west, beyond the Euphrates, whispers grow louder, of enemies uniting, of betrayal within. The empire that rose through terror may soon drown in it. Welcome to the entire history of the Assyrian Empire, a story written in iron and blood. The birth of an empire, from Ashur's Assyrians. Have you ever wondered how a civilization can rise from dust, not by peace or faith, but through terror so calculated it became its greatest weapon? And what if the same terror that built their empire was destined to destroy it? This is the story of the Assyrians, the people who turned war into art, and fear into faith, long before the world knew of Nineveh and Nimrod. There was Ashur, a small city crouched along the banks of the Tigris River. It was not a mighty capital then, but a humble trading outpost surrounded by wild plains and rival tribes. The desert winds carried scents of copper and incense, the chatter of merchants bartering over lapis lazuli and grain. To the south lay Sumer, ancient and wise. To the west, Amorite raiders roamed the borders. The Assyrians were not warriors yet. They were survivors, learning to bend rather than break, but survival breeds ambition. The people of Ashur were shrewd, practical, and restless. Their gods demanded sacrifice, but their hearts demanded more: power, safety, permanence. As trade flourished, so did their hunger for control. Caravans came and went, but each journey reminded them of danger. Bandits prowled the roads. Rivals extorted tolls. To survive, they needed walls. To expand, they needed armies. And so, a civilization born from trade began to forge the first tools of war. From this fragile beginning rose one man who would change everything. Shamshi-Adad. He was no heir of peace. His youth was spent in exile, watching kingdoms rise and fall like the shifting sands. But ambition burned in him like a forge. When he returned to Ashur, he did not come as a son, he came as a conqueror. With cunning alliances and ruthless strategy, he seized the throne and began shaping Assyria's first empire. City after city fell under his command, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of iron will. Under Shamshi-Adad, Assyria became more than a city, it became an idea. He declared war to be sacred, a divine act commanded by the god Ashur himself. To fight was to worship. To conquer was to please the divine. And so began a pattern that would define Assyria for centuries. Every battle fought in the name of heaven. Every enemy slain as an offering to the gods, yet power, as it always does, brought decay. Shamshi-Adad's sons were weak and divided. They squabbled over provinces and abandoned the discipline their father built. When he died, his empire splintered. The cities he united fell apart, the soldiers he trained deserted, and the great experiment of Assyria seemed doomed to be forgotten. But the Assyrians were not a people who vanished easily. Their defeats became lessons. Their ruins became warnings. For centuries they lived under foreign rule, Mitanni, Hittites, Babylonians, but they remembered. They remembered the taste of empire and the glory of Ashur. When the world least expected it, the Assyrians rose again. In the 14th century BCE, a king named Ashur-Uballit I reignited the spark. Unlike Shamshi-Adad, he did not rush to conquer. He built patiently. He sent letters to pharaohs and Babylonian kings, addressing them not as masters but as equals. "Great king," he wrote, a title reserved only for empires. And in that moment, with ink and arrogance, He declared Assyria's rebirth, his armies were disciplined, his fortresses rebuilt. Trade once again flowed through the Tigris, guarded by soldiers instead of merchants. When Babylon rebelled, Ashur-Uballit struck swiftly and without mercy, reducing its power to ash. The Assyrians had learned the first rule of empire: mercy was weakness, and fear was order. This philosophy hardened under kings like Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled in the 11th century BCE. He was a man who believed that the world existed only to test his strength. His inscriptions, carved into stone slabs that still survive, read like confessions of conquest. He wrote of rivers running red with blood, of enemy kings flayed alive, of cities turned to dust. To modernize, it seems monstrous. To the Assyrians, it was divine justice, proof that their God favored them. The Assyrian army became the terror of the ancient world. They were not just fighters. They were engineers, artists of war. They invented the siege tower, a towering wooden beast that crawled to city walls while archers rained arrows from above. They designed iron weapons sharper and stronger than the bronze of their enemies. Every victory was carved into palace walls, detailed scenes of battle, prisoners chained, kings kneeling before Ashur's image. This was propaganda before propaganda had a name, but even storms lose strength. The endless wars drained their resources. The conquered lands rebelled, the fields dried, and new invaders pressed from the north. The empire that seemed eternal began to fracture. The great kings were gone. Weak rulers followed, clinging to fading glory. For nearly 2 centuries, Assyria shrank back into obscurity, yet history had already written their name in fire. And it refused to let it fade. In the 10th century BCE, a new generation of kings rose, men like Ashur II. Pragmatic and cold as iron, they studied the mistakes of their ancestors. They rebuilt the army with discipline and structure. Gone were the chaotic levies of peasants. In their place marched professional soldiers, organized, trained, and armed with iron blades. They brought innovation to the battlefield, standardized chariots, cavalry units, and the first standing army in recorded history. With this new might, the Assyrians began reclaiming their lost lands. One by one, their enemies fell. The cities that once mocked them now paid tribute. The merchants who once feared their raids now traded under their banners. And within the palaces of Ashur, a whisper grew louder: "The god has returned to favor us." But power feeds on hunger, and hunger never ends. As the Assyrian banners spread across the Fertile Crescent, new threats emerged, alliances forming in secret, rebellions stirring in silence. The kings of Assyria had conquered the land, but not the hearts of those who lived under them. Every province conquered was a wound waiting to reopen. Every victory carried the seed of revenge. Yet, in the heart of Nineveh, the new capital, the kings saw only glory. They built temples so vast they seemed to touch the sky, lined their palaces with gold, and filled their gardens with exotic animals brought from the corners of their empire. They believed their rule was eternal, divinely sanctioned, unbreakable. But beyond their walls, the world was watching and waiting. The Babylonians to the south, the Medes to the east, the Elamites beyond the Zagros Mountains. Enemies who had once knelt were now rising again. Still, in this moment, Assyria stood undefeated. Its armies ruled by iron, its gods ruled by fear, and its kings ruled by both. But history moves in shadows. And in those shadows, something was coming, something that would test the empire more than any war before. The question was no longer how Assyria would rise. It was how long it could survive its own power. The rise of iron and the reign of Kings. Have you ever seen power so absolute it begins to believe it can never die? That was Assyria in its prime, an empire forged not only in blood but in iron, and iron, as every blacksmith knows, is both creation and destruction. The very metal that made them unstoppable would one day turn their world to ash. The 9th century BCE marked a new dawn for Assyria. The long centuries of retreat were over. The kings who rose now were not mere rulers. They were architects of terror, visionaries of control. At the forefront stood one name that echoed across the lands like thunder: Ashurbanipal I. He was not a man of mercy. When he inherited the throne, the empire was still fragile, its borders uncertain, its enemies defiant. But Ashurbanipal had no patience for weakness. He reorganized the army into the most efficient killing machine the ancient world had ever seen. Each soldier was a cog in a divine engine, disciplined, armored, and bound by faith in their god and fear of their king. Iron swords replaced bronze. Siege towers rolled like thunder toward enemy gates. Archers advanced in waves, while engineers tore down walls with mechanical precision. But what truly set the Assyrians apart was their philosophy of fear. Ashurbanipal II understood something no ruler before him dared to embrace. That terror itself was a weapon sharper than any blade. When he conquered a city, he didn't just defeat it. He made it an example. His records, carved in cuneiform on stone tablets, describe acts of horror meant not for the victims but for the witnesses. He flayed rebel leaders alive and displayed their skins on city walls. He impaled prisoners along roads leading into conquered towns so that every traveler knew what disobedience meant, and it worked. Cities surrendered before his armies arrived. Whole nations submitted without battle. Fear became the empire's most powerful ally, from his newly built capital at Kalhu, a glittering city of palaces, gardens, and towering sculptures. Ashurbanipal declared that Assyria was reborn. Artists carved his victories into alabaster walls, soldiers marching in perfect formation, captives kneeling, rivers of blood flowing beneath the wheels of his chariot. Even the gods seemed to watch in approval from the reliefs above. But behind the glory was a quiet question: could any empire built on terror truly endure? His son, Shalmaneser III, believed it could. He took his father's legacy and expanded it beyond imagination. His armies marched to the Mediterranean, clashed with the Arameans, and fought the great coalition of Israelite and Phoenician kings at Karkar. The Assyrians called it a victory, though, in truth, the battle was inconclusive. Yet, in their records, there was no room for doubt. To the Assyrians, history was not what happened, it was what they declared. Shalmaneser ruled for 35 years, but time eroded his strength. The endless wars drained the treasury. The soldiers grew weary. Even the gods seemed silent. When his sons turned against each other in a brutal civil war, the empire trembled. Brother fought brother, generals switched sides, and the land that had once ruled through unity now bled from within. For a moment, it seemed the iron heart of Assyria would finally stop beating, but then came a man who refused to let it die, Tiglath-Pileser III. His name would become legend. Not only for conquest, but for innovation. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. He rebuilt the empire from its foundations, not merely as a kingdom, but as a machine. He reorganized provinces, imposed a network of governors loyal only to him, and introduced a system of tribute that poured wealth from every corner of the empire into the heart of Nineveh. He was also the first Assyrian ruler to turn deportation into a political weapon. When a city rebelled, its people were uprooted and resettled far away, replaced by loyal subjects. Entire cultures vanished overnight, their identities erased, their names forgotten. This policy, brutal and brilliant, ensured that rebellion rarely rose twice in the same place. It also began a process of cultural blending that would ripple through history, one that future empires from Babylon to Rome would copy. Under Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrian army became unstoppable. They moved like a single organism, disciplined, efficient, merciless. Iron armor gleamed beneath the sun. Chariots thundered across deserts. Siege engines crashed through stone gates. Wherever they marched, cities fell. Israel, Damascus, Babylon, all either bowed or burned. In the halls of Nineveh, the spoils of war glittered like stars. Gold, ivory, exotic animals, captives skilled in every trade. The empire became a living museum of its own conquests. But with wealth came arrogance, and with arrogance came rot. After Tiglath-Pileser's death, the empire passed to Sargon II, a man who claimed to be chosen directly by the gods, though some whispered he was a usurper. To silence doubt, he built a new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, fortress of Sargon. It was meant to be the perfect city, symmetrical streets, monumental temples, and walls inscribed with his victories. But fate mocked him. He died in battle, his body never recovered. To the superstitious Assyrians, this was a curse, a sign the gods had turned their faces away. His grand city was abandoned before it was even finished, left to the desert winds. Yet the empire did not fall. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, carried the legacy forward with fire and fury. His reign would become infamous, not for conquest alone but for vengeance. When the city of Babylon rebelled against him, Sennacherib unleashed a destruction so absolute that the name Babylon was nearly erased from memory. He flooded it, tore down its temples, and carried its gods away in chains. To the world, he was a monster. To his people, he was divine justice incarnate, but vengeance is a double-edged sword. Not long after his greatest victory, Sennacherib was struck down, murdered in his own temple by his sons. The empire he ruled through terror now trembled under its own weight. Still, from the chaos rose one last towering figure, Esarhaddon, his surviving son. He rebuilt Babylon not out of mercy but to restore cosmic balance. He claimed that even destruction required repentance. It was a rare moment of humility in a dynasty forged from pride. And for a brief time, the Assyrian Empire found peace. But peace, for Assyria, was only the silence between storms. Esarhaddon's successor, Ashurbanipal, would push the empire to its greatest height, and to the brink of ruin. As we leave this chapter, the Assyrian banners stretch from Egypt to Persia. Their libraries overflow with knowledge, their palaces with wealth, their soldiers with pride. To the outside world, they are gods among men, but deep within Nineveh, the whispers grow louder, that iron, once their strength, has begun to rust. That no wall, however high, can guard against time. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen armies are gathering, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike. Ashurbanipal, the scholar king and the fall of Fear. Have you ever met a conqueror who loved books more than blood? A king who wielded both the sword and the stylus, who ruled the greatest empire on earth not only through terror, but through knowledge? That man was Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, and the final flame before the darkness. When Ashurbanipal ascended the throne in the 7th century BCE, Assyria stood at the height of its glory. The empire stretched from Egypt's sands to Persia's mountains, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the valleys of Elam. Its palaces gleamed with gold, its armies unmatched. But at its core was a paradox. The empire that ruled by fear was now ruled by a scholar. Ashurbanipal was not like his forefathers. Where they gloried in slaughter, he gloried in knowledge. From childhood, he was trained in reading and writing, rare for kings of his time. He studied Sumerian, Akkadian, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, even divination. While his generals sharpened swords, Ashurbanipal sharpened his mind. Yet, beneath his calm intellect lay the cold steel of an Assyrian heart. He could discuss philosophy 1 hour and order a city's destruction the next. His reign began with grandeur. Nineveh, his capital, became the beating heart of civilization. He filled it with scholars, scribes, and artists from across the empire. From Egypt came papyrus and wisdom. From Babylon came the ancient texts of gods and men. Ashurbanipal gathered them all, ordering copies to be made of every known work, myths, laws, rituals, omens. Thus, he created the first great library in human history, the Library of Ashurbanipal. Imagine its halls, clay tablets stacked like books, thousands upon thousands, each inscribed with cuneiform script. The Epic of Gilgamesh, ancient medical recipes, star charts, spells, poems, hymns, an entire civilization written in clay. Ashurbanipal didn't just want to rule the world. He wanted to preserve it, but outside those walls of learning, the world was changing. The empire was vast, but stretched thin. Conquered nations seethed with resentment. Egypt rebelled. Elam plotted revenge. Babylon, rebuilt and proud once more, simmered with defiance. At first, Ashurbanipal's brilliance seemed to outshine them all. His armies crushed rebellion after rebellion. In Egypt, he humbled pharaohs. In Elam, he unleashed devastation so complete that the land became unrecognizable. His own records boast, "I destroyed its cities, I salted its fields, I took its gods and broke their temples. I made the ground where it stood like the floodplain of the sea." To his people he was divine vengeance. To his enemies he was apocalypse. But power is a beast that eats its master. As Ashurbanipal's victories multiplied, so did his arrogance. He began to see himself as not merely the servant of Ashur, but his equal. His palace walls showed him towering over his enemies, lions beneath his chariot wheels. In one famous carving, he hunts lions in a vast arena, a spectacle of courage, but also a metaphor. The lions are the world, struggling against fate. The king stands as fate itself, yet behind the grandeur the empire was rotting. The machinery of fear that had kept the provinces obedient for centuries began to grind down. Generals grew ambitious. Governors became corrupt. The taxes that fed Nineveh's palaces drained the lifeblood from the outer lands. People began to whisper that the gods had turned away, that Assyria's time was ending, and then came betrayal, not from enemies, but from within the royal bloodline itself. Ashurbanipal's brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, who ruled Babylon as a vassal king, rose in rebellion. Babylon, that ancient rival, had endured Assyrian wrath before, but now it rose with vengeance in its heart. The rebellion spread like wildfire, joined by Elamites, Arabs, and Chaldeans, a vast coalition against the Assyrian yoke. For 3 long years, brother fought brother. Babylon burned, rebuilt, and burned again. The war was not just political, it was personal, spiritual, mythic. Ashurbanipal's letters to his gods became desperate. Why, O Ashur, do you test me so? Why must brother turn against brother? But in the end, the scholar king proved as ruthless as any warrior before him. He crushed the rebellion, besieged Babylon, and starved it into submission. His brother died in the flames, and the city was left in ruins once more, yet victory came with a curse. The empire was exhausted. Its armies had bled for decades. Its lands were restless. The people of the west resented their conquerors. The Medes in the east and the Babylonians to the south were watching, waiting, rebuilding strength in silence. Inside Nineveh, Ashurbanipal retreated deeper into his palaces and his library. He studied omens, consulted priests, read prophecies that spoke of doom. The clay tablets whispered that no empire lasts forever, not even one blessed by Ashur, and as if summoned by those prophecies, strange signs began to appear. Floods struck the Tigris plain. Plagues spread through the cities. Earthquakes shook the temples. The gods, it seemed, were no longer silent. They were angry. When Ashurbanipal died, around 627 BCE, no one knew exactly how. Some say he died peacefully. Others claim he vanished into legend. But with his death, the Iron Order of Assyria fractured. His successors lacked his intelligence, his authority, his ruthless precision. The throne became a prize to be seized, not a destiny to be inherited. In the years that followed, the empire that once ruled the known world began to unravel. Provinces broke away. Rebellions ignited faster than they could be crushed. The Babylonians and the Medes, ancient enemies now united by hatred, saw their chance. Nineveh, the invincible city, began to hear whispers of armies moving in the dark. Armies that carried vengeance in their hearts and justice in their swords, and as the Assyrian kings squabbled in their palaces, a shadow was rising beyond the mountains, one that would end the age of iron and terror. Once and for all, the Assyrians had spent centuries teaching the world to fear them. Now, the world was coming to return the lesson. The fall of Nineveh, the night the empire died. Have you ever wondered what it sounds like when an empire dies? Not suddenly, but slowly, painfully, like a beast realizing its own end has come. That was Assyria in its final days, still powerful, still dangerous, but bleeding from within. And at its heart, behind towering walls and golden gates, was Nineveh, the city that believed it could never fall. The year was 612 BC. The Assyrian Empire had stretched across centuries and continents. But the gods were silent and the omens were dark. After the death of Ashurbanipal, chaos swept through the royal line. Kings rose and fell in a blur of assassinations. Armies mutinied. The once great capital of Ashur lay abandoned, while Nineveh, jewel of the Tigris, stood like a lonely sun burning at the edge of a dying world. Inside its walls, the streets were still lined with marble lions. its palaces filled with the spoils of centuries. The murals still told stories of conquest, kings trampling enemies, soldiers leading captives by chains. But outside those walls, the world had changed. The old enemies had returned, and this time they came together, the Babylonians. Long humiliated under Assyrian rule, forged an alliance with the Medes, fierce warriors from the mountains of Iran. For generations they had watched Assyria dominate the world with iron and fear. Now they smelled blood. Led by Nabopolassar of Babylon and Saxares of Media, they formed a coalition unlike any the world had seen, united by vengeance. It began quietly. First came the siege of Ashur, the ancient spiritual heart of the empire. The defenders fought like lions, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. When the city fell, it was not merely captured, it was annihilated. The temples were looted, the priests slain, the sacred ziggurats leveled. The god Ashur, once invincible, was silenced. For the first time in history, the Assyrians were not feared. They were pitied, but Nineveh still stood. Its walls were colossal, nearly 100 feet high and thick enough for 3 chariots to race side by side. Its gates gleamed with bronze, its towers watched every horizon. The people believed no force could ever breach it. And for a time, that belief held true. When the Babylonian-Median alliance marched on Nineveh, the city's defenders poured boiling oil from the ramparts, rained arrows, and unleashed massive stones from siege towers. The attackers were repelled again and again. For 3 long months, Nineveh stood firm. Its people prayed. Its king, Sennacherib, sent desperate messengers begging for reinforcements that would never come. Then came the Omen, the Tigris River, swollen with summer floods, broke its banks. The waters surged against the city's outer walls, softening the clay foundations, cracking the stones. The attackers saw their chance. As the floodwaters receded, the Babylonians and Medes stormed through the weakened breach. The invincible walls of Nineveh had been undone not by human hands, but by nature, or perhaps by the will of the gods themselves. What followed was slaughter. The invaders poured into the streets. The once proud Assyrian soldiers fought with desperation, but there was no order left, no command, no hope. Fire consumed the palaces. The great library of Ashurbanipal, that treasure of knowledge and wisdom, burned. Thousands of clay tablets, inscribed with the thoughts and stories of humanity's earliest civilizations, cracked and shattered in the flames. The river ran red. The king, seeing that all was lost, retreated to his palace and set it ablaze. Some say he died in the flames, others that he took his own life before the fire reached him. Either way, the empire ended as it began, in blood and fire. When the smoke cleared, Nineveh was no more. The Babylonians looted its treasures, the Medes carried off its survivors as slaves. The once mighty Assyrian heartland became a wasteland. To the world, it was as though the empire had never existed. Its name became a curse whispered by mothers to frighten their children. The ancient historian Nahum would later write, "Nineveh is laid waste. Who will mourn for her?" And indeed, no one did, but history is strange. The Assyrians, who believed their legacy would last forever through terror, were remembered not for their cruelty, but for their brilliance. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Nineveh, they found fragments of that lost library, the clay tablets that survived the flames. Within them were the earliest records of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, was among them. Through those broken tablets, the voices of the dead spoke again. It is ironic. The kings who carved their victories in stone, to be remembered for eternity, were forgotten. Yet the scholars they employed, the scribes they barely noticed, preserved their civilization forever. In the ashes of Nineveh, the world moved on. Babylon rose in its place, shining briefly before falling to Persia. Persia would fall to Greece, Greece to Rome, and so the wheel of empire turned again. But each new conqueror carried, somewhere in their legacy, a piece of Assyria, its administration, its art, its cruelty, its genius, and yet there is something haunting about the way Nineveh fell. Because in the end, it was not simply an empire that died. It was an idea. That fear alone could hold the world together, The Babylonians celebrated their victory. But even they must have looked at the burning ruins and wondered, if Assyria could fall, could anyone truly rule forever? And as the last flames flickered over the broken walls of Nineveh, a voice, perhaps the echo of Ashurbanipal himself, seemed to whisper through the smoke, "Empires are mortal. Only stories survive?" But the story isn't over. Because from Assyria's ashes, something unexpected was already stirring: a new world order, a new vision of power, and a new chapter in the saga of civilization. Echoes of empire, the legacy of Assyri. Have you ever wondered what happens after the end, when the fire fades, the swords rust, and the conquerors become dust? When the echoes of an empire linger long after its walls have crumbled? That is the story of Assyria's true immortality. Its empire died in flames, but its shadow never left the world. When Nineveh fell, the conquerors thought they had erased Assyria forever. The Babylonians rejoiced, the Medes celebrated, and the survivors of 1,000 subjugated nations cheered at the sight of their tormentors destroyed. The great palaces were plundered, the ziggurats toppled, and the land left desolate. For decades, travelers avoided the ruins. They said ghosts wandered there, the spirits of kings who once believed themselves gods. But time, as always, began to rewrite the story. The same Babylonians who tore Nineveh apart soon found themselves walking in its footsteps. They built grand cities, raised temples to their own gods, and governed through the same administrative systems the Assyrians had perfected. The Assyrian bureaucracy, the network of governors, tax collectors, scribes, and spies, became the model for every empire that followed. Babylon may have inherited Assyria's lands, but it also inherited its mind. Farther west, the echoes spread. The Persians who rose under Cyrus the Great studied the Assyrians carefully. They learned how to manage vast territories through loyalty and fear, how to move armies swiftly across great distances, how to govern through organization rather than chaos. The royal road of Persia, the great artery of communication, was born from Assyrian ideas of imperial order. Even the notion of divine kingship, the belief that a ruler stood as the chosen of heaven, came from Ashur's priests and their kings who claimed to rule by God's command. It is strange, isn't it? The empire that taught the world to fear it also taught the world how to rule. And then came Greece. The Greeks looked upon the ruins of Nineveh with curiosity, not hatred. To them, Assyria was ancient, mythical, a civilization of giants. Herodotus and Xenophon wrote of its vast armies and cruel kings, but also of its beauty and wealth. The Greeks adopted parts of its art and architecture, the grand columns, the winged beasts, the motifs of kings and gods. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia centuries later, he visited the plains where Nineveh once stood. They say he stood in silence, gazing at the ruins half buried in sand, and whispered, "So this is where greatness ends." Yet even that wasn't the end. Rome, the greatest heir to empire, unknowingly carried Assyria's ghost in its veins. The Roman legions, with their organization and discipline, echoed the Assyrian model. Their governors ruled provinces in the same fashion the Assyrians once had. Their triumphal processions, displaying captured kings and spoils of war, were mirror images of Assyrian celebrations carved on palace walls centuries before. And perhaps most hauntingly of all, even their enemies remembered them. The Hebrew prophets, who once suffered under Assyrian conquest, immortalized Nineveh in Scripture. The Book of Nahum thundered against it, declaring it doomed for its cruelty. Woe to the bloody city, full of lies and plunder. But the Book of Jonah told a different tale of repentance, of mercy. It imagined that even Nineveh, the city of terror, could change. That is how powerful Assyria's name had become. It no longer needed armies or kings to command fear. Its story had become a warning, a mirror for every empire that rose after it. Beware the pride that blinds you. Beware the cruelty that sustains you, for the same terror you wield will one day consume you. Centuries turned into millennia. The Assyrians faded from history, their language forgotten, their cities buried under earth. By the time the Middle Ages came, the world thought they had been legends, monsters from the Bible, not real people. But the earth keeps its secrets well. In the 19th century, the sands of Mesopotamia began to whisper again. European explorers, chasing the stories of scripture and myth, dug into the mounds of northern Iraq. What they found stunned the world. Beneath layers of dirt lay colossal stone bowls with human faces, the Lamassu, guardians of lost palaces. Walls covered in carvings showed battles, hunts, and processions that no eye had seen for 2,000 years. And then, among the ruins of Nineveh, came the discovery that changed history, the library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of clay tablets, miraculously preserved by fire and time, emerged from the ash. On them were the words of the ancients, medicine, laws, prophecies, mathematics, hymns, and epic tales. Among them lay the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving story. The Assyrians, long thought to be destroyers, were revealed to be preservers of knowledge, curators of humanity's earliest wisdom. Suddenly, the world realized that the same people who built towers of skulls also built libraries, that the same hand that wielded the sword could also carve poetry into stone. The image of Assyria transformed from mere brutality into complexity, a civilization of brilliance and contradictions. Today, their descendants still live, Assyrian Christians scattered across Iraq, Syria, and beyond. Though their empire is gone, their identity endures. They speak fragments of the ancient Aramaic tongue, carry the cross where their ancestors once carried spears, and tell stories of Nineveh not as myth, but as memory. And if you stand among the ruins of that ancient city today, you can still feel it, the echo of empire. The broken walls glowing in the sunset, the silent Lamassu watching over empty plains. It feels as though time itself holds its breath there, remembering, because Assyria never truly died. Its legacy runs through the veins of every civilization that came after, in every empire that dreamed of eternity, in every ruler who believed fear could command loyalty, and in every scholar who preserved words against the silence of oblivion. The Assyrians believed they could write their power into stone, that the world would remember their might forever. What they didn't know was that their greatest legacy wouldn't be fear, it would be knowledge. The sword rusts, the wall crumbles, but the story endures. So when we speak of Assyria, we do not just speak of war or conquest. We speak of humanity's first empire, our reflection in the ancient mirror. The light and shadow of civilization itself, and maybe, just maybe, the ghost of Ashurbanipal smiles each time another tablet is read. Another story retold, because somewhere in the echo of history, the scholar king still whispers, empires die. But words never do.